The Secret Life of Dali. Prologue. At the age of 6, I wanted to be a cook. At 7, I wanted to be Napoleon, and my ambition has been growing steadily since then. Stendhal somewhere quotes the remark of an Italian princess who was eating ice cream with enormous relish one hot evening. "Isn't it too bad this is not a sin?" she exclaimed. When I was 6, it was a sin for me to eat food of any kind in the kitchen. Going into this part of the house was one of the few things categorically forbidden me by my parents. I would stand around for hours, my mouth watering, till I saw my chance to sneak into that place of enchantment, and, while the maid stood by and screamed with delight, I would snatch a piece of raw meat or a broiled mushroom on which I would nearly choke, but which, to me, had the marvelous flavor, the intoxicating quality that only fear and guilt can impart. Aside from being forbidden in the kitchen, I was allowed to do anything I pleased. I wet my bed till I was 8, for the sheer fun of it. I was the absolute monarch of the house. Nothing was good enough for me. My father and mother worshipped me. On the day of the Feast of Kings, I remember among innumerable gifts, a dazzling king's costume, a gold crown studded with great topazes, and an ermine cape. From that time on, I lived almost continually disguised in this costume. When I was chased out of the kitchen by the bustling maids, how often would I stand in the dark hallway, glued to the spot, dressed in my kingly robes, my scepter in one hand, and in the other a leather-thonged mattress beater, trembling with rage and possessed by an overwhelming desire to give the maids a good beating. This was during the anguishing hour before the sweltering, hallucinatory summer noon. Behind the partly opened kitchen door, I could hear the scurrying of these bestial women with red hands. I would catch glimpses of their heavy rumps and their hair straggling like manes. And out of the heat and confusion that rose from the conglomeration of sweaty women, scattered grapes, boiling oil, fur plucked from rabbits' armpits, scissors spattered with mayonnaise, kidneys, and the warble of canaries. Out of that whole conglomeration of the imponderable and inaugural fragrance of the forthcoming meal was wafted to me, mingled with a kind of acrid horse smell, the beaten white of egg caught by a ray of sunlight, cutting through a whirl of smoke and flies, glistening exactly like froth forming at the mouths of panting horses rolling in the dust and being bloodily whipped to bring them to their feet. As I said, I was a spoiled child. My brother died at the age of 7 from an attack of meningitis, 3 years before I was born. His death plunged my father and mother into the depths of despair. They found consolation only upon my arrival into the world. My brother and I resembled each other like 2 drops of water, but we had different reflections. Like myself, he had the unmistakable facial morphology of a genius. He gave signs of alarming precocity, but his glance was veiled by the melancholy characterizing insurmountable intelligence. I, on the other hand, was much less intelligent, but I reflected everything. I was to become the prototype par excellence of the phenomenally retarded, polymorphous perverse. Having kept almost intact all the reminiscences of the nursling's erogenous paradises, I clutched at pleasure with boundless, selfless eagerness, and on the slightest provocation I would become dangerous. One evening I brutally scratched my nurse in the cheek with a safety pin, though I adored her, merely because the shop to which she took me to buy some sugar onions I had begged for was already closed. In other words, I was viable. My brother was probably a first version of myself, but conceived too much in the absolute. We know today that form is always the product of an inquisitorial process of matter. The specific reaction of matter, when subjected to the terrible coercion of space, choking it on all sides, pressing and squeezing it out, producing the swellings that burst from its life, to the exact limits of the rigorous contours of its own originality of reaction. How many times matter endowed with a too absolute impulse is annihilated, whereas another bit of matter, which tries to do only what it can and is better adapted to the pleasure of molding itself by contracting in its own way before the tyrannical impact of space, is able to invent its own original form of life. What is lighter, more fanciful and free to all appearances than the arborescent blossoming of agates? Yet, they result from the most ferocious constraint of a colloidal environment, imprisoned in the most relentless of inquisitorial structures and subjected to all the tortures of compression and moral asphyxiation, so that their most delicate, airy, and ornamental ramifications are, it seems, but the traces of its hopeless search for escape from its death agony, the last gasps of a bit of matter that will not give up before it has reached the ultimate vegetations of the mineral dream. Hence, what we have in the case of the agate is not a plant transformed into a mineral, or even a plant caught and swallowed up in a mineral. On the contrary, what we actually have, the spectral apparition of the plant, its arborescent and mortal hallucination, the end and form of inquisitorial and pitiless constraint of the mineral world. So too the rose. Each flower grows in a prison. In the aesthetic point of view, freedom is formlessness. It is now known, through recent findings in morphology, glory to be to Goethe for having invented this word of incalculable moment, a word that would have appealed to Leonardo, that most often is precisely the heterogeneous and anarchistic tendencies offering the greatest complexity of antagonisms that lead to the triumphant reign of the most rigorous hierarchies of form. Even as men with unilateral one-way minds were burned by the fire of the Holy Inquisition, so multiform anarchistic minds, precisely because they were such, found in the light of these flames the flowering of their most individual spiritual morphology. My brother, as I have already said, had one of these insurmountable intelligences with a single direction and fixed reflections that are consumed or deprived of form. Whereas I was the backward anarchistic polymorphous perverse. With extreme mobility, I reflected all objects of consciousness as though they were sweets, and all sweets as though they were materialized objects of consciousness. Everything modified me. Nothing changed me. I was soft, cowardly, and resilient. The colloidal environment of my mind was to find in the unique and inquisitorial rigor of Spanish thought the definitive form of the bloody, Jesuitical, and arborescent agates of my curious genius. My parents baptized me with the same name as my brother, Salvador. And I was destined, as my name indicates, for nothing less than to rescue painting from the void of modern art, and to do so in this abominable epic of mechanical and mediocre catastrophes in which we have the distress and the honor to live. If I look toward the past, beings like Raphael appear to me as true gods. I am perhaps the only one today to know why it will henceforth be impossible even remotely to approximate the splendors of the Raphaelesque forms. And my own work appears to me a great disaster, for I should like to have lived in an epoch during which nothing needed to be saved. But if I turn my eyes toward the present, although I do not underestimate specialized intelligences much superior to my own, yes, I shall repeat it 100 times, I would for nothing in the world change places with anyone whomsoever among my contemporaries. And the ever perspicacious reader will already have discovered without difficulty that modesty is not my specialty. One single being has reached a plane of life whose image is comparable to the serene perfections of the Renaissance. And this being happens to be precisely Gala, my wife, whom I had the miracle to choose. She is composed of those fleeting attitudes, of those Ninth Symphony-like facial expressions, which, reflecting the architectonic contours of a perfect soul, become crystallized on the very shore line of the flesh, at the skin's surface, in the sea foam of the hierarchies of her own life, and which, having been classified, clarified by the most delicate breezes of the sentiments, harden, are organized, and become architecture in flesh and bone. And for this reason I can say of Gala, seated, that she resembles perfectly, that she is posed with the same grace as Il Tempietto di Bramante, near the church of San Pietro in Montenorio in Rome. For, like Stendhal in the Vatican, I too can measure exactly the slim columns of her pride, the tender and stubborn banisters of her childhood, and the divine stairways of her smile. And so, as I watch her from the corner of my eye during the long hours I spend huddled before my easel, I say to myself that she is well painted as a Raphael or a Vermeer. The beings around us look as though they were not even finished, and so badly painted. Or rather, they look like those sordid caricatural sketches hastily drawn on cafe terraces by men with stomachs convulsed by hunger. I have said that at the age of 7 I wanted to be Napoleon, and I must explain this. On the 3rd floor of our house lived an Argentine family named Matas, one of whose daughters, Ursulita, was a renowned beauty. It was whispered in the Catalonian oral mythology of 1900 that she had been selected by Eugenio d'Ors as the archetype of Catalonian woman. In his book, La Ben Plantada, the well-planted one. Shortly after I reached the age of 7, the all-powerful social libidinal traction of the 3rd floor began to exercise its sway over me. In the sultry twilights of early summer, I would sometimes abruptly interrupt the supreme pleasure of drinking from the terrace faucet, delightfully thirsty, my heart beating fast, when the almost imperceptible creaking of the 3rd floor balcony door made me hope it would perhaps open. On the 3rd floor, I was worshipped as I was at home. There, every day about 6, around a monumental table in a drawing room with a stuffed stork, a group of fascinating creatures with the hair and the Argentine accent of angels would sit and take mate, served in a silver sipper which was passed from mouth to mouth. This oral promiscuity troubled me peculiarly and engendered in me whirls of moral uneasiness in which the blue flashes of the diamonds of jealousy already shone. I would in turn sip the tepid liquid, which to me was sweeter than honey, that honey which, as is known, is sweeter than blood itself. For my mother, my blood was always present. My social fixation was sealed by the triumphal and surer road of the erogenous zone of my own mouth. I wished to sip Napoleon's liquid, for Napoleon was there. In the 3rd floor drawing room, there was a picture of him in the center of the circle of glorious polychromes that adorned one end of a tin keg. This little keg was painted to look like wood and contained the voluptuous substance of mate. The object was precisely placed on a centerpiece in the exact middle of the table. Napoleon's image reproduced on the mate keg meant everything to me. For years, his attitude of Olympian pride, the white and edible strip of his smooth belly, the feverish pink flesh of those imperial cheeks, the indecent, melodic, and categorical black of the spectral outline of his hat, corresponded exactly to the ideal model I had chosen for myself, the king. At that time, people were singing the stirring song Napoleon en el final d'un ramalet colossal. This little picture of Napoleon had forcefully taken hold of the very core of the still non-existent contours of my spirit, like the yolk of an egg fried in a pan, without the pan, and yet already in the center of the pan. Thus, I frantically established hierarchies in the course of a year. From wanting to be a cook, I awakened to the very person of Napoleon from my impersonal costume of an obscure king. The furtive, nutritive delights had assumed the architectural form of a small tabernacle, the keg containing the mate, the swarming erotic emotions aroused by the confused visions of the creatures, half women, half horses, who inhabited the kitchen below, had given way to those of the third-floor drawing-room, provoked by the serene image of a true lady, Ursulita Matas, the 1900 archetype of beauty. Later on, I shall explain and minutely describe several thinking machines of my invention. One of these is based on the idea of the wonderful edible Napoleon, in which I have materially realized those two essential phantoms of my early childhood, nutritive oral delirium and blinding spiritual imperialism. It will then become clear as daylight why 50 small goblets filled with lukewarm milk hung on a rocking chair as to my mind exactly the same thing as the plump thighs of Napoleon. Since this may become true for everyone, and since there are all sorts of advantages in being able to look upon things in this way, I shall explain these and many other enigmas, even stranger and no less exact, in the course of this sensational book. One thing, at least, is certain. Everything, absolutely everything, that I shall say here is entirely and exclusively my own fault.